Menstrual cycle is an average 28-day cycle every female goes through after menarche. Menarche is a point during puberty where an adolescent female gets her first menstrual cycle. Following menarche, menstrual cycle occurs on a monthly basis till the point of menopause. Menopause is the natural decline of the reproductive hormones which stop the occurrence of menstrual cycles. Menstrual cycle on average lasts for 28 days and it can be divided into two halves, pre-ovulatory and post-ovulatory. Pre-ovulatory is the phase of the cycle which occurs before ovulation and post-ovulatory is the phase of the cycle which occurs after ovulation. Ovulation occurs on day 14 of the cycle, so pre-ovulatory would be day 1 to 13 and post-ovulatory would be day 15 to 28. Within the menstrual cycle, there are different phases for the endometrium, which is a layer of tissues that lines the uterus, and for the ovaries. The pre-ovulatory phase for the endometrium is known as the proliferative phase, and the pre-ovulatory phase for the ovaries is known as the follicular phase. The post-ovulatory phase for the endometrium is called the secretory phase, and the post-ovulatory phase for the ovaries is called the luteal phase. Let's start with the ovaries. The pre-ovulatory ovarian cycle, otherwise known as the follicular phase, starts with the hypothalamus in the brain. The hypothalamus secretes gonadotrophin-releasing hormones, or GnRH. This stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete follicle-stimulating hormones and luteinizing hormones. The ovaries are made of many immature cells, each contained within a follicle. There are many such follicles in the ovaries, and the LH and FSH hormones bind to certain receptors on these follicles, and this stimulates the production of the hormone estrogen. All of this happened during the first 10 days. In the next 4 days, which is from day 10 to 14, the follicles grow and continue to produce estrogen, and estrogen levels in the blood continue to rise. At one point, this acts as a stimulus for a negative feedback mechanism. The increase in estrogen levels acts as a stimuli to the pituitary glands, asking them to produce less of FH and LSH hormones. Till this stage, many follicles in the ovaries were developing, but once the levels of FH and LSH in the blood reduces, most of the follicles stop growing and slowly die. But the one follicle with the highest number of receptors for the two hormones continue to grow and becomes the dominant follicle, which will eventually be the follicle that goes through ovulation. The dominant follicle continues to grow and produces estrogen, and this time it leads to a positive feedback loop. The increase in estrogen levels make the pituitary gland more responsive to gonadotrophin releasing hormones, which causes them to secrete a bunch load of FSH and LH into the bloodstream. This spike in the two hormones occurs a day or two before ovulation. This increase in the levels of luteinizing hormones is the hormone trigger for the oocyte to break through the follicle and the ovary. Yes, that's right. The oocyte ruptures the follicle first and then ruptures the ovary to go into the fallopian tube. This was the pre-ovulatory phase of the ovaries. During the pre-ovulatory phase, the endometrium goes through its own cycle, which is known as the proliferative phase. The endometrium is the lining of the uterus, which is responsible for protecting and nourishing an embryo if fertilization occurs. During the first 5 days of this phase, the thick layers of endometrium and spiral arteries shed and leave the body through the vagina. This occurs if fertilization doesn't occur. If in case it does, then the menstrual cycle stops and the endometrium layer remains in the body. Once menstruation is complete, the high estrogen levels in the bloodstream cause the thickening of the endometrium and the development of spiral arteries. Spiral arteries are special arteries that provide the endometrium with nutrients it requires to grow, and it emerges from the basal layer of the uterus. Similarly, the rising estrogen levels cause the cervical mucus to become more hospitable to sperm. The development of the endometrium and the change in the cervix both help in increasing the chances of fertilization. This increased chance of fertilization is highest between day 11 and day 15 of an average 28-day cycle. This is the end of the proliferative phase. Now let's move on to the post-ovulatory phase. Let's start with the post-ovulatory phase of the ovaries, which is known as the luteal phase. After ovulation, the empty ruptured follicle develops into the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum has the same cells with the receptors for LH and FSH hormones. So they continue to produce estrogen, but at the same time they start to produce a hormone progesterone. The release of progesterone is due to high levels of LH in the body. Progesterone that is released by the corpus luteum acts as a stimulus for a negative feedback mechanism. The increase in progesterone levels make the pituitary gland produce less FSH and LH hormones. And as we know, without FSH and LH, estrogen will not be produced. So a reduced concentration of FSH and LH result in a reduction of estrogen production. This feedback mechanism helps progesterone become the dominant hormone during this phase of the cycle. The increase in progesterone levels causes the uterus to enter the secretory phase. During the secretory phase, the increase in progesterone makes the endometrium more receptive to implantation and the spiral arteries grow further. After day 15 of the menstrual cycle, the opportunity for fertilization begins to reduce. After this stage, the corpus luteum begins to gradually degenerate into the corpus albicans. Corpus albicans doesn't produce estrogen or progesterone. Due to this, the estrogen and progesterone levels in the body begin to decline until one point where it reaches its lowest. Progesterone is a hormone responsible for the development of the endometrium, and when the progesterone levels reaches its minimum, the spiral arteries begin to collapse and the endometrium prepares to shed. The shedding of the endometrium would start on day 1 of the next menstrual cycle, and this entire process repeats until menopause and pauses during pregnancy. Well, that's all for today. Thank you so much for